He was the kind of man everyone assumed had everything: fortune, control, status, but no one ever wondered what it felt like to be loved only for what you could give. Until one day, a nurse walked into his life with a perfect smile and a plan. She didn't know the fortune was already gone, and that the man she believed she was deceiving had been preparing for her all along. What unfolded wasn't a story about money, but about truth, silence, and the legacy no one saw coming. Enjoy the story. He wasn't the kind of grandfather who told jokes at the dinner table or handed out candy from his coat pocket. No, my grandfather was the man who wore expensive silence like a tailored suit. His wealth was the only thing people saw, and for most of my life, that's exactly how they treated him. He sat at the head of every table, yet no one ever asked what he was thinking. They assumed money had given him everything, and so they gave him nothing in return, except attention, whenever they needed something, and he knew it. He had the kind of presence that filled a room without saying a word. When he spoke, people listened, but they rarely remembered what he said, only what he might give. Birthdays became events when he showed up, not because they missed him, but because his presence usually meant a generous check tucked inside an envelope. Every holiday felt like a transaction, and I watched it happen year after year. A family orbiting around a man they never tried to know. I was just a kid when I noticed it, but even then I knew. There was something sad in his eyes, no matter how full his glass was. He wasn't flashy. That's what always confused people. No new cars, no designer watches. He wore the same jacket every winter for over a decade. But everyone knew what he was worth, or what they thought he was worth. Rumors whispered between relatives. He bought half that hotel downtown, one uncle once said. No, he has Swiss accounts, an aunt corrected, her eyes narrowing, like she was trying to guess a secret code. No one asked him directly. They just made their assumptions and kept smiling whenever he reached for the bill. As I got older, I started visiting him alone. Not because I wanted anything. Honestly, I think I just wanted to sit in silence with someone who didn't try to impress me, and maybe he sensed that. Our conversations were short but honest. He'd pour tea slowly, always without sugar, and sit across from me by the window. They only call when their accounts run dry, he said once, no anger in his voice, just tired truth. I asked him if that bothered him. He stared out at the garden for a long time before answering, only when I let it. Despite everything, he still gave, quietly, generously, but he never seemed surprised when the thanks wore off fast. He had been rich for decades, but I don't think anyone had ever made him feel valuable. Not really. Until she walked in, I didn't notice her at first. None of us did. She wasn't loud, and she wasn't dressed to catch attention. She wore light blue scrubs, had a calm smile, and moved with practiced grace. She was just another nurse in a long list of people paid to keep him alive, but she stayed a little longer in the room that day. And so did his eyes. She laughed at something he said. Not one of his rare jokes, but one of his thoughtful observations. And I saw something shift in him, the way he leaned forward, the way he watched her as she left. It wasn't desire. It was something softer, something dangerously close to hope. At first I thought it was sweet, a lonely man finding joy in a moment of kindness. But I should have known. In a life where everyone takes, kindness is rarely free. And sometimes it's the most expensive thing you can fall for. What none of us knew, what she didn't know, was that the money everyone thought he had was already gone. And the story she thought she was stepping into was not the, one he had written. Her name was Claire. At least, that's what she told us. She introduced herself with a practiced warmth, the kind of voice that made old men feel young again and skeptics let down their guard. She wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, but every move she made was deliberate. She brought him water before he asked, adjusted his pillow like it was an art form, and laughed at his dry comments like they were comedy gold. Everyone noticed the change in him, how his eyes followed her when she left the room, how he spoke. her name softer than he did anyone else's. For a man who had built walls taller than most would ever climb, she walked right in like the gate had always been open. The rest of the family wasn't subtle. My uncle made crude jokes about nurses, in it for the tip. My aunt rolled her eyes every time Claire's name came up. "Oh, her again," she'd say. "Isn't it funny how she always ends up on his rotation?" But no one ever said anything to her face, because Claire was always perfect. Smiling, just enough to be warm, standing just close enough to be intimate, but never giving anyone a reason to accuse her of anything. She knew exactly what she was doing, and Grandpa didn't seem to mind. In fact, I think he enjoyed watching the rest of us squirm while she poured his tea. He started requesting her by name. Not often, just enough for the staff to notice. Flowers appeared in his room. Small things. A book she said she loved, suddenly on his nightstand. A bracelet she admired, showing up on her wrist one day without a word about who gave it. I started to pay more attention. It wasn't jealousy, it was instinct. Something in me said, "Look closer." And when I did, I saw the way her eyes would dart to his watch when he wasn't looking. How she took mental notes when he talked about his past, especially the parts involving real estate, stocks, old business partners. She never asked directly, but she listened like someone who was building a case. I didn't want to believe. She was after something. Maybe I didn't want to be cynical like the rest of the family. But one night I passed by the hallway outside his room and heard her laughing. Not the way she laughed with him, but louder, sharper. I looked through the window. She was on her phone, and she said something I'll never forget. "Trust me. By Christmas, I won't be clocking in here anymore." Then she turned around and saw me. She didn't flinch, just smiled. "Hey," she said, like nothing had happened. "Just checking in on Mr. Ellis. He's doing great tonight." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that sentence in my head. The timing, the tone, the certainty. She wasn't just hoping for something. She was planning it. And my grandfather, the man who had been wise enough to outlive betrayal after betrayal, was letting her in. I wanted to scream, to warn him. But how do you tell a man who has been used his entire life that someone else is doing it again, when the only thing he's holding on to is the illusion that this time it might be different? Instead, I asked him casually the next day, "How's Claire?" He looked up from his tea, eyes soft but sharp, and said, "She reminds me of someone I knew a long time ago." Then he paused, smiled without joy, and added, "But I don't think that person ever existed either." That's when I realized he knew, maybe not everything, but enough to see through the cracks in her smile, enough to understand what was happening. And yet, he let her stay. Not because he believed in her, but because he was waiting to see if she'd love the man, or the myth of what he still had. It didn't take long before she started planting roots, not in the building, but in his routine. Claire brought him lunch even when she wasn't on shift. She started humming his favorite songs, quoting lines from books he once mentioned, in passing, and calling him by nicknames like Joey, a name no one in the family had used in decades. It was calculated closeness, the kind that wraps around a person gently until they don't realize they're being tied down. And everyone, especially the ones who still had dreams of inheritance, began to notice. My father, who hadn't visited Grandpa in months, suddenly made an appearance, sat beside his bed and asked forced questions about his health, his medications, even his sleep schedule. But none of it was real. He glanced toward the corner of the room every few seconds, where Claire had just left her purse. "You think she's after something?" he whispered to me later. I didn't answer, because we both already knew the answer. The real question wasn't if, it was how far. And Claire? She leaned into the suspicion, almost like it amused her. She started brushing his arm when she spoke, stayed longer during visits. Began saying things like, "We're a good team, aren't we?" Or, "I don't want to imagine life without you." The subtlety began to fade. What had been suggestion was now becoming possession. One evening I walked in and heard her say, "You know, I've never felt this safe with anyone before." And he, always the master of measured expression, simply looked up and said, "Is that safety? Or security?" Still, he didn't push her away, and I couldn't tell if it was because he was lonely or curious. Watching her, testing her, seeing how deep she would go in a game he had been forced to play his entire life. That's when it hit me. Grandpa wasn't naive, he was patient, and somewhere inside he was building a final test, a quiet trap. Not to punish her, but to reveal something. The shift came when she started asking about the future, casually at first. "Have you ever thought about selling that property in Palm Beach?" she asked one day, spooning soup into his bowl. "I bet the market's strong." "Right now," he nodded, said nothing. Then a week later, "If we ever moved somewhere quieter, where would we go?" She was moving fast now, confident, a predator who thought her prey was tired. But Grandpa, he was watching every move, counting steps. Then she said it. "We should get away sometime, you and me, before things get complicated." There it was, the pivot from caregiver to partner, the assumption of intimacy. And when he didn't protest, she smiled like she had won, like she was halfway to becoming Mrs. Ellis. But that night I found him writing in his old notebook, the one he never let anyone touch. I asked him, "You really think she loves you?" He didn't look up, just kept writing, then said, "I don't think she even knows what love is, but I know what she's looking for." I asked him what that was. He closed the book. Leverage. That's when I knew. He had let her believe she was leading the dance, while he was already planning the final step. And the next time she tried to hold his hand, he didn't pull away. Because sometimes, you have to let them get close, just close enough to reveal everything. It was late afternoon when I saw them together. My grandfather sitting by the window in his armchair, Claire perched on the edge of the bed beside him. The light hit just right, casting shadows across his hands as he gently folded a piece of paper into thirds. She leaned in. Her voice, soft like a stage whisper, asked, "Have you ever thought about updating your will?" It wasn't sudden. It wasn't desperate. It was surgical. She knew the timing. She had spent weeks building the illusion of trust, of love, of care. And now she wanted the signature to make it permanent. He looked at her, long, still, then smiled. Not wide, just enough to make her think she'd finally crossed the finish line. "That's a very grown-up question," he said, with a tone even I couldn't read. She giggled, as if this moment wasn't the culmination of a long, quiet hunt, as if this man, who had built empires and buried secrets deeper than most people had roots, was just a frail old fool waiting to be rescued into a fairy tale. That ended in her name on his estate, but he didn't give her the answer she wanted, not yet. He told her he'd think about it, that maybe it was time, that she made him feel alive again. She touched his hand, kissed his cheek, and for the first time, I watched him let her believe she had won. Because that's what she needed. That's what he was giving her. The illusion of victory before the truth arrived. That night I found him at his writing desk. The notebook was open again, but beside it now was a sealed envelope. Cream-colored, thick, marked with a red wax stamp. His name on the front, mine on the back. "She'll ask again," he said without looking up, "and when she does, you'll take this to Langston." I knew that name, the family lawyer, the one who handled everything after Grandma died. I asked him what was inside. He tapped the seal with one finger. The real will. That's when it hit me, the brilliance of it. He wasn't just one step ahead, he was miles ahead. While Claire was plotting to become his future, he had already written a version of it she'd never touch. A version not built on who could seduce him in his final days, but who stayed when there was nothing left to take. I asked if he wanted me to stop her. He shook his head. Why ruin the show? Let her perform. His voice was calm, cold, but not cruel. He wasn't angry. He was prepared. And there's a difference. He had spent his whole life watching people change when money entered the room. And now, with nothing left but stories and paper, he was crafting the ending with the same control he'd once used to build a fortune. Claire, of course, came back the next day, smiling wider, wearing perfume she knew he liked, holding his favorite, tea. "I've been thinking," she said, "maybe we should meet with someone together, about your estate." She said together like it was romantic, like she was a partner in all this. He nodded. "I think that's a good idea." And that was it. No resistance, no questions. Just enough agreement to keep her leaning further into her own trap. I delivered the envelope to Langston 2 days later. When he opened it, his eyes flicked across the room, then back at me. "He planned this perfectly," he said. "Not a penny for the family, not a word about her, but something far more valuable for the person who stood with him until the end." "What's that?" I asked. Langston smiled. "Control." I didn't understand what that meant until the final revisions were filed. Until I saw that everything, every asset, every hidden account, every deed he still held, had been transferred, not to me, not directly, but to a foundation. One built in my name, with his vision, with one clear rule. It could never be dissolved, never be sold, and never be used for profit. Claire wouldn't find herself in the will. The family wouldn't find anything in probate. The legacy he left wasn't for those who asked for it, but for those who showed up with nothing to gain. And soon, the performance she had so carefully choreographed would find itself without an audience. Claire started wearing lipstick around him. Not the subtle kind she used before, but bold, like someone claiming territory with color. She brought meals from her home now, telling him they were her grandmother's recipes. Lasagna, chicken soup, banana bread, she said, had healing properties. Every dish came with a story. Every story came with a look. And every look was saying one thing: I belong here. She began using the word we. We should plan a trip. We should look at cottages. We should talk about what happens next. Her voice was syrup, thick, sweet, slow. And my grandfather, calm as ever, let every word settle without reacting. He didn't pull back. He didn't rush forward. He watched, quietly. He was a man measuring truth through patience, and Claire had no idea she was being weighed with every visit, every promise, every touch. One evening, I walked into his room and found her massaging his hands. She smiled at me like I was interrupting a honeymoon. "He's got the hands of a builder," she said. "I told him he should have been an artist." Grandpa chuckled, a single dry sound. I was, just not with paint. Then he looked at me. His eyes told me everything. "Stay quiet. It's almost time." The next morning I found an envelope waiting for me at his desk. Inside was a letter. Short. No greeting, no signature. She wants a future with a man she thinks exists, but I'm giving her something better. A mirror. He had begun preparing the final act. Claire kept talking about marriage. Not in direct terms, not yet, but close. "It would be nice to have someone to come home to," she said while fluffing his pillow. "Someone who makes decisions together. Someone who's there for the good and the bad." It was the kind of pitch you'd expect from a late-night commercial, and he smiled right through it. Every time, she asked once, "Do you believe in love at this stage in life?" He answered without blinking, "I believe in clarity." A few days later, she started planning a surprise trip. Something small, a beach town. Nothing too far, but just far enough to be exclusive. She talked about sunsets and walks on the pier and waking up to fresh coffee together. I could almost see the script she was rehearsing, scene by scene. But what she didn't know was that he'd already written the ending, and she wasn't the star. He began giving her space, to push harder, to show her hand. And she did. "I don't care what your family thinks. she told him one afternoon. "They've never appreciated you like I do. They don't know what you're worth." He looked at her slowly. "What am I worth?" he asked. She faltered. Just a second, but it was enough. Then she recovered, more than they could ever count. His eyes didn't leave hers. Good, because they stopped counting years ago. And with that, he stood up, slowly, with purpose, and walked to his desk, where the final letter waited. Not for her, but for the storm she didn't know she was walking into. Claire's confidence had evolved into entitlement. She no longer asked. She assumed. Assumed she'd ride in the front seat when the driver came. Assumed she could enter his home without knocking. Assumed her name would one day be stitched onto the edge of a family legacy she never helped build. But what she didn't realize was that the man she had set her sights on no longer existed, not in the way she believed. Because the fortune she thought she was securing was already gone, and had been for a long time. My grandfather had let her fall in love with a version of himself that was part memory, part illusion, a character he'd kept alive just long enough for people like her to reveal who they truly were. The man with properties and accounts, with hidden safes and passive incomes, was nothing but a ghost wearing his clothes. The real Joseph Ellis had stopped being rich years ago, but he had never stopped being powerful, because he knew something most people don't. That perception is currency. And he spent it carefully. The family had always chased him for what they thought he had. Claire was no different. Just better dressed, more patient, but not smarter. She asked again one evening, more directly this time. "I think we should talk to someone about formalizing things," she said, holding his hand gently. "I want to be there for you, legally, emotionally, completely." It sounded like love, but it felt like a contract, and Grandpa just nodded. "Let's do that. Let's make it official." That was the final trigger. She believed she'd won. The next week, she started referring to herself as his partner. Posted a photo online of a dinner together with the caption, "The beginning of forever." Wore a ring on her finger, not given, but claimed. Told the nurses to address her as Mrs. Ellis soon. It spread through the halls quickly. Family members started calling, whispering, asking if there was a prenup, asking if he had lost his mind. But Grandpa, he remained calm. Calm like a man watching rain hit a roof he spent decades building. The real moment came when Claire tried to access his bank, not to withdraw, just to check balances. She had prepared for this moment. Even had paperwork drawn up to request co-signature privileges under the guise of health emergencies. What she didn't expect was the response. A bank manager, tight-lipped and professional, told her the account didn't exist. Not in the way she imagined. Just one modest checking account remained, barely enough for basic bills. She argued, she insisted, then she demanded, and when she returned to the hospital that evening, her eyes had changed. Gone was the syrup. Gone was the sweetness. What? Sat across from him now was someone cold, calculating, unmasked. "You lied to me," she said. Grandpa blinked slowly. "No," he said. "You lied to yourself." She stood there, stunned, not by the absence of wealth, but by the fact that she had built a future on a foundation that had never existed. "All this time," she hissed, "you let me believe—" "I let you speak," he interrupted, "and I listened. Every word." She started to say something else, but stopped. The air had changed. The room wasn't warm anymore. It wasn't hers. It never had been. She turned, grabbed her purse, and walked out. No goodbye, no apology, just silence, and he watched her leave. With the same calm he had carried all along. Because the lie she fell in love with, it was never about him. It was about the man she thought she could claim. And that man had died long before she arrived. The truth, it turns out, doesn't always arrive in a thunderstorm or a courtroom. Sometimes it comes in the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the click of a pen, and the flat tone of a bank employee saying, "There's nothing here." That's what Claire heard when she tried to access the fortune she believed she'd secured. She had gone in dressed like someone about to inherit a legacy, Clean lines, polished shoes, a smile trained for charm, but left like someone who had just realized they had spent months rehearsing for a role in a play that didn't exist. The account was real, but there were no millions, no estates, no offshore holdings, just a modest checking account, barely enough to cover medical expenses and living costs. The bank manager, professional to the end, offered her a brochure on financial planning. She didn't take it. She stormed out. She didn't return to the hospital for 2 days, and when she did, she wasn't holding his hand anymore. She stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, mask peeled off. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, without warmth. No nickname, no soft voice, just the sterile tone of someone measuring what little is left to take. Grandpa didn't flinch. "You never asked," he said, adjusting his blanket like they were discussing the weather. "You let me waste my time," she hissed. "You let me believe—" "I let you choose," he said. Her lips parted, but no words came. Because deep down, she knew. Every moment of kindness she offered was transactional. Every gentle smile had strings, and now that the strings were cut, so was her performance. She left the room without another word, and that's when he finally sighed, not with pain, but with release. "It's strange," he told me later. She was the only one honest about being dishonest. Everyone else just wears better masks. That week, Grandpa seemed lighter, like a man who had finally closed a chapter that had been writing itself without his consent for far too long. He donated his remaining possessions, a few rare books, to a local library, his watch to a young nurse whose father once admired it. His old suit, the one he wore when he met my grandmother, was laid out neatly with a note. No one wore it better, but someone else should now. He called Langston for one final meeting. I was there. No legal language, no transactions, just a handshake and 2 simple sentences. "It's all yours now. Don't waste it." I thought he meant the foundation, the properties tied to Hearthlight, the journal, the instructions. But I understood later. He meant the silence, the wisdom, the way he'd waited, watched, and only spoken when the words actually mattered. Claire never came back. She didn't return calls, didn't ask for closure, didn't try to reclaim the story, because there was nothing left to take. The man she'd chased had never been real. And the one she walked away from? He was finally free. The absence of Claire was louder than any confrontation could have been. No slamming doors, no accusations, no final plea for forgiveness. She simply vanished, as if erasing herself from. The script she'd written would spare her the embarrassment of not getting the ending she wanted. But her silence said everything. And my grandfather didn't fill the space she left behind. He didn't speak of her again. He didn't joke. He didn't mourn. He simply moved forward, as if she had been nothing more than another breeze passing through a window he never opened in the first place. But I knew better. I knew that kind of silence only comes from a place of deep clarity, the kind of clarity that doesn't hurt, but reveals. He had seen her clearly from the start. The difference was, he wanted her to see herself. And she did. In the reflection of an empty account, in the echo of a man who never begged her to stay, she looked into what she thought was a gold mine, and found only herself. That was the most valuable truth he could have given her. His days became slower after that, quieter too, but not lonely. I began to visit him more frequently, not out of guilt, not out of duty, but because I saw him now. Not the myth of the rich man, not the icon our family feared and respected from a distance, but the man behind all of it, the man who chose silence as defense, the man who knew what it meant to be wanted for everything except who you really are. We talked about simple things, the sound of morning birds, the way tea tastes different when it's made slowly. One afternoon, I asked him if he ever regretted letting her get so close. He didn't even pause. "Regret comes when you don't learn," he said. But I learned everything I needed to. Then he turned to me and added, "So did you." He wasn't talking about her anymore. He was talking about me. about how he had been waiting for someone, anyone, to see past the performance, to stay when there was nothing to take, to listen without expecting a return. And now that I had, he could finally rest. We spent his final week side by side. No grand speeches, no family visitors, just soft music, handwritten notes, and quiet meals. One night, as the sun dipped below the hills outside his window, he handed me a small envelope. "Don't open it yet," he said, "not until the last chair is empty." I knew what he meant. He passed in the early morning without a sound, no machines, no struggle, just a deep final breath, the kind that only comes when a man knows his story ended the way he intended. There was no funeral procession, no reading of a will. Just a cremation, a small gathering, and a chair left empty at the end of the table. The same chair no one ever sat in, the one that had always been his. That night, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single line. "Silence doesn't mean nothing was said. It means I finally don't need to explain." And for the first time I cried, not for what we lost, but for what we finally understood. It's strange how easy it is to miss the full shape of a person when you only look from your own angle. My whole life, I thought I knew my grandfather. I thought he was just a man who had money, who stayed quiet, who rarely smiled and never asked for help. But what I came to realize, too late for conversation but just in time for truth, was that he wasn't any of those things. He was a man who made choices, not because he was guarded, but because he had already seen what people do when they think you owe them something. And he wasn't bitter, he was observant. Quiet because the world never earned his words. In the days after his passing, the house didn't feel empty. It felt full of thoughts, of stories that never made it into words, of the kind of peace that only follows a life lived on one's own terms. The family came around, of course. Not all at once and not with grief in their eyes. Most were confused, some were angry, a few pretended to care, but no one stayed long. They wanted to know where the will was. They wanted to know what was left. They wanted once again to take something from a man who had already given more than they could understand. I told them there was no inheritance. Not in the way they expected. There was no big account to divide, no properties to claim, no safety net built from decades of sacrifice, just one foundation, one journal, and a series of handwritten letters he had left only for those who had shown up when there was nothing left to gain. Some of them didn't believe me. They thought I was hiding something, that I had manipulated him, that I was the new thief in a long legacy of unclaimed riches, but they were wrong, because I had nothing in my hands, except the truth. One day I walked through the house and noticed how many things he had intentionally left untouched. His study still had stacks of books with bookmarks halfway through. His closet still smelled like the same cologne he'd worn every day for 30 years. His desk drawer held a photo of my grandmother, perfectly preserved, with a note on the back. The only person who knew the real me and loved me anyway. That single sentence struck harder than anything he'd ever said aloud. I sat in that house for hours, thinking about how many people we never really know, about how often we judge others based on what they give us, what we can measure, what we can own. But the best parts of my grandfather, his wisdom, his discipline, his quiet love, were things you couldn't hold in your hands. You could only feel them, and most people never took the time to try. He used to say, "The loudest ones rarely last, but the quiet ones, we echo." I understand now what he meant. Claire had been loud, loud in presence, loud in performance. And now, she was gone, forgotten. But him? He was everywhere, in every page of his journal, in every quiet choice he made, in every moment. Someone sat beside him and chose to listen instead of ask. What we choose to see in people often says more about us than it does about them. Most saw an old man with money. I finally saw a man who spent his life testing the depth of the people around him. A man who understood that legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you build into someone else's hands. And now those hands were mine. There was no ribbon, No safe deposit key. No dramatic reveal of hidden gold or lost deeds. The final gift my grandfather left me didn't come in a package. It came in the form of responsibility. Quiet, steady, and carved into paper like a map only I could read. When I returned to Langston's office a week after the burial, he handed me a folder. Nothing stamped in red, no legal drama. Just one document and one message. He trusted you to finish what he started. Inside was a charter for something called the Ellis Foundation for Restored Dignity, a small non-profit, not flashy, no headlines, but with clear purpose, to support care workers, lonely seniors, and overlooked people in long-term homes who had no one left to visit them. It wasn't about saving the world, it was about reminding someone, anyone, that they were still seen, that they still mattered, that they weren't just shadows at the edge of life's stage. The foundation didn't come with millions, but it came with something far rarer: his story. His journal was now its centerpiece, and with it, the promise that no one would have to die invisible again. Every donor received a copy of one of his handwritten pages. Every volunteer read one before they started. Not to idolize him, but to understand the power of presence, to understand that sometimes showing up is the most radical thing you can do. I began working with a small team: nurses, retired social workers, people who had lived through silence and knew what it meant. We started visiting homes that had been forgotten by everyone but their residents. We sat with people who had outlived their family, their fortune, and their relevance. We listened. And in their words, I started to hear echoes of Grandpa, not in tone, but in truth. Stories told slowly, eyes that carried entire lives, hands that still remembered how to give, even if no one was asking. One woman, Margaret, told me her husband died holding a letter he never got to finish. She never threw it away. I asked her if I could read it. She handed it to me like it was a child. Inside were only 6 words: "I'm sorry I waited to speak." I didn't cry then, but later I sat alone in the car with the letter in my lap and wept. Because that's what my grandfather had avoided. That's what his silence had protected me from. The regret of arriving too late to truly see someone. The final gift wasn't money. It wasn't property. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't show up in youth or success or applause. The kind that only comes when you've seen what the world does to those who outlive their usefulness and choose instead to become useful in a new way. I never asked for this. He never forced it on me. He just trusted I would know what to do. And maybe that was the real inheritance. Not trust funds or family businesses, but belief. A belief passed silently, through time, through pain, through ink from one hand to another, and in that belief, I didn't just find him. I finally found myself. People still ask me, sometimes in whispers, sometimes outright, "So what did you inherit?" They want to know what he left behind. If I found gold bars under the floorboards or secret bonds in a Swiss account, they expect a number. Something they can measure. Something they can compare. But I never give them the answer they want. Because the truth is, my grandfather's gold was never in his bank account. It was in his restraint, his foresight, his ability to see through people and still choose to stay kind, not naive, not bitter, but intentional. And that kind of wealth doesn't make headlines. It makes legacies. Hearthlight is quiet now, but not empty. The halls echo with slow footsteps and soft conversations. The fireplace always burns low, like it's holding something sacred in its flame. New residents arrive every few weeks, most of them with eyes that no longer expect to be seen. But they're seen here, not for their resumes, not for what they can offer, but for who they still are, even after the world has tried to move past them. Some of them read from Grandpa's journal during the evenings. Others write their own. And every time someone says, "No one ever asked me that before," I hear his voice in the silence. I keep his chair by the window, the one no one else sits in, not because of superstition, but because it's his. It always will be. It's the seat he earned not through power, but through patience. The place where he watched others pretend to love him, and waited for someone to love him anyway. It reminds me every day that even the most invisible people are often the ones holding everything together. I no longer search for proof of who he was. I don't need old newspaper clippings or ledgers. I don't need spreadsheets or framed photographs. I have his story, and that's more than enough. Because stories like his don't need monuments. They need voices. They need spaces. They need people willing to carry the silence he protected so carefully. People like me. I've stopped trying to explain him to others. Some won't get it. They'll think he was foolish, that he let people use him, that he gave away too much. But I know better. He gave what mattered. And in return, he took nothing he couldn't carry into death, only the peace of knowing he had been seen by at least one person before his final breath. When I walk past his chair, I sometimes whisper, "They still don't understand." And in my mind, I always hear the same reply, "They don't need to, you do." Because the gold, the fortune, the inheritance, it was never about money. It was about meaning, and I carry that now, not in my wallet, but in my hands, in the lives we restore, in the stories we listen to, in the hearts we refuse to let die invisible. If this story made you pause, breathe, or remember someone you once overlooked, then take this moment and turn it into something. Don't let this be just another video you scroll past. Let it be the one that makes you call someone who's been silent for too long. Sit with someone who doesn't get asked how they really feel. And if you've ever felt invisible yourself, know this. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. You are not without value. Tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from, and who is the quietest person you've ever known? The one who left you something you couldn't spend, but will carry forever. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories that go beyond wealth, beyond noise, beyond the surface, then like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching and for listening.